It is a privilege for me to welcome as our guest one of my own. She is one of my nieces, and I was explaining this morning how it is that she became my niece. I knew her before she was born. That is, I knew her before her mother and father knew each other. That's how far back we go. Her father and I were classmates at Alabama State College back in the late 40s. Many of you were not born then, I understand that. But he and I became such good friends that he spent as much time at my home eating my dinner as he stayed at his home, where he didn't have any dinner because he did not have a wife and didn't have any children. But notwithstanding that, he and I became very, very close friends and stayed friends for many years. Now I can say it was prophetic that I would get to know her father as a college student in the late 40s, because here, go fast forward now to the early 60s, 1961, when I got in deep trouble in Albany, Georgia, because I had told a bunch of people, come on and follow me off to jail. We're going to break down the walls of segregation in Albany, Georgia. We're going to open this thing up. And they just fell in line and just followed me on off to jail, like the Pied Piper. And now I got all these people in jail. What am I going to do next? I had no idea. But I remembered I had made a friend in Montgomery, Alabama, as a student. That friend was her father. So when I said to him, come and help me, I got all these people in jail, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to get them out. He had the experience because he had been a leader, first in the Montgomery Improvement Association, but later in the Montgomery bus boycott. That was the beginning of the end of segregation in America as we knew it. The beginning of the end was with her father in Montgomery, Alabama. He had joined forces with Martin Luther King, who I had met later, because Martin Luther King and my late brother-in-law were very close friends. And it's coincidental that that same brother-in-law got to know her father and her mother, and in fact married them. How prophetic. You can't write a story like that. Now she's a story writer, but you can't write a story like that. How we came to be what we are in family. So when I say she is my niece, you understand the close family relationship that we have. I'm so proud of her, as I am proud of my other children, mind you. But she is an actress extraordinaire. She's a writer, she's a producer. And those of you who watch television, you no doubt have seen her, but did not know who she was. Now, let me see some of you who watch things like Any Day Now, that drama series. Huh? You know about drama, that drama day, Any Day Now. Gods and Generals, you've heard of Gods and Generals? Grill, that comedy. Now, we sit and watch the Comedy Channel mostly every night now, but we got to make sure that we watch it when Grilled is on. Don King, everybody knows the Don King with his wild hair. Well, if you had watched that Only in America, who do you think was starring in Only in America? Donzaleigh. She has been in a number of noted movies and television series. Of recent advent, Delmar CSI, some of you watch CSI. This is a new series, CSI Las Vegas. You will see her starring in that. She's in 50 Seconds, that is upcoming. And she's in the process now of writing a documentary about the civil rights movement, especially where it focuses on her father. Much of that history is lost, and it's up to her and those of us who were close to him to make sure that he becomes a part of the living history of the civil rights movement. Because had it not been for people like her father, we would not have the privileges that we enjoy today. So I'm honored to introduce to you my niece, one of those I love very much, one who has made me very proud to be able to do the things that I do, Donzaleigh Abernathy. Let's welcome her.
Thank you, Uncle Andy. Like he said, he's my Uncle Andy, and I've known him my whole life. Uncle Andy and Aunt Norma, and now
Rhea.
Rhea, who is now a part of our family. Dean, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I love Michigan. I love the people of Michigan, and I love Michigan State. It's a great opportunity for me, and I just, I gotta tell you all, I was speaking for the Martin Luther King celebration in Southfield, and Uncle Andy was in the audience, and he saw my presentation, and he called and he said, I want you to come to Michigan State, and I want you to do the same thing that you did. And so I'm not going to do exactly the same thing, but I'm just going to tell you all my story, which is our story. It's the history of the civil rights movement. I won't talk that long. I just want to tell the story because we are the last ones that are around. My mother is the only person left from the beginning of the civil rights movement, and Uncle Andy, who led the Albany movement, and I guess it's next week you're going to have Reverend Jim Lawson, who I had the great pleasure of learning nonviolence from with Glenn Smiley in Los Angeles, California. So those people will soon not be with us, and maybe the day will come that I won't be here. So we have a moral obligation to tell you our story, so historians of the future can tell the story in an accurate way. Anyway, I'm going to start with these photographs over here. I had these, I pulled these together from my documentary. Are they going to come, or did they stop? They will come again? There they are. That's me right there, that little girl in that striped sweater. That's my brother and my sister. That's Uncle Maude and Uncle Retta and my dad behind with his mouth wide open. I have no memory whatsoever of that day. This is the Selma to Montgomery March. Huh? No, the little one, without that. That's the proclamation that my dad issued. So now, today, we have a Martin Luther King holiday. He issued the proclamation in 1970. He wanted to create the holiday. Congressman John Conyers from Detroit took it to Congress. Senator Ed Brooke took it to the Senate in years of struggle. That's Daddy and Uncle Martin and the Good Friday March. I'm going to tell you about that a little bit later. But you see they dressed alike? They were so sharp. There they are in their Blues Brothers sunglasses. They try to do everything alike. And that's, I think that's Chief Laurie Pritchett, is that not? In Albany. And, you know, it was a hostile environment. And this is the Selma to Montgomery March a little bit later that day. My mother's the woman right there in the center with Ralph Bunch and talking to Uncle Martin. He was fascinated by my mother. He used to always come over to our house, and our house was the place, the center focus of everything. And then here is Daddy and Uncle Martin and Lyndon Baines Johnson as they're signing into law the Voting Rights Act so that black people and Asian people and Latino people could have the right to vote. And so, and there's my mother again with my dad with her mouth wide open, and I love it. She's singing, and Uncle Martin's leaning onto Mother, and right there, my dad is carrying my mother's shoe bag. He was such a gentleman. And here, Daddy and Uncle Martin in Birmingham. I believe that's Birmingham. And I just found this photograph when I'm doing this documentary and trying to tell the story. And yeah. So let me begin. Pat, how do we switch it over? Yeah. The love of my life, I know I'm married, and but the love of my life is my dad. I lost my dad April 17th, 1990. And as God would have it, I was the only person that was there for my family with him that morning. I wasn't there the day that my dad was born, but I was blessed to be there the day that he left the earth. The last thing he said to me was, I love you, Donzaleigh. I said, I love you, Daddy. And they shut the elevator doors and they took him down to the emergency room to check on him, to see why he had shortness of breath. He died from 2 blood clots. That's a silent killer. One went to the lung, one went to the heart, and it cut off his breathing. We didn't know what was happening. He was in the hospital, so how could you possibly know? Anyway, when I lost my dad, I knew that I had to tell his story, and so I started writing a book. and I had to tell the story of my dad, and telling the story of my dad evolved into the story of Martin Luther King, who I knew as my Uncle Martin. I knew him my whole life, just like I knew Uncle Andy. He blessed me as a baby. He knew me before I knew myself. He taught us how to misbehave and how to have exuberance of life. And then the book evolved to the history of the civil rights movement and to the history of black people in America. This was the first cover of my book, and this is from the Selma to Montgomery March, and this was my first publisher. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wrote my foreword. I met Bobby Kennedy. You know, I knew of him growing up, but I personally met him when 1980 Democratic National Convention, and he was with Lemoyne Billings, who was President John Kennedy's best friend. And when my dad died, Bobby came down to Atlanta and spent 2 days with me. Then he took me up to his house a few months later, to his home in Bedford, and he showed me the book that he'd written about Lemoyne Billings, John Kennedy's best friend. And I knew Lem, so he wanted me to see the book. And as I'm looking at it, I thought to myself, Bobby's written a book. Oh my God, I'm smart as Bobby. If Bobby can write a book, I can write a book too. So that was my motivation for writing the book. And I asked him to write the foreword, and he wrote the foreword for me. The reason this first photograph didn't work for me as the cover of the book was because everybody on that cover were black. And the civil rights movement, the beauty of the civil rights movement was that it was black and white people coming together. Ralph Bunche, that really light-skinned man in the middle, is black. And he was with the United Nations, and I wanted something that reflected the world in which we lived, so I needed to find another cover for the book. Anyway, I like to include this photograph so people understand. I'm just going to tell you really fast. Black people arrived in the United States of America in 1619. I can't say it any plainer than that. 1619. We arrived at the mouth of the James River to Jamestown, Virginia, to harvest the tobacco crop. We worked from sunup to sundown, and we were given no freedom. Unlike white slaves that arrived during that time, they became indentured servants and were able to merge into the population. Black people were not allowed to merge into the population. We endured 244 years of slavery. I know sometimes you all have hardship in life and you think it's going to last forever. But could you imagine that it would go on for hundreds of years, your suffering? The pain that you might feel in your feet, or the pain you might feel in your back, or the pain when you say goodbye to a loved one. We had to endure that all the time. When you fell in love with somebody and the overseer decided that they were going to separate the husbands from their wives, or mothers give birth to their babies, and as soon as they are no longer sucking from the breast, they decide to take that baby away from that mother and sell that child on an auction block. Well, that was what happened to black people repeatedly, over and over and over and over, destroying the unit of our family, pulling us apart for 244 years. Thankfully, John Brown decided, you all know who John Brown was, the abolitionist. He decided that he was going to have his own insurrection and give black people all these weapons in the armory at Harper's Ferry, and took over and started shooting people. Ultimately, he lost his life. But he was an abolitionist, and violence was not the way. Robert E. Lee hung him, but that helped kickstart the Civil War. And after that Civil War, we gained our freedom. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. They issued the Emancipation Proclamation. For a few years, we had a little bit of freedom. My grandpa George, my father's grandpa George, my great-grandfather, he was 12 years old when Abraham Lincoln signed that Emancipation Proclamation. Like I said, that was my great-grandfather. That wasn't that long ago. He was my father's grandfather. He lived longer than my father. But he used to always tell my daddy about the time when black people had the right to vote, when black people had freedoms, and that the bottom rail will rise to the top one day, and freedom will not always be denied to black people. So my dad believed that. He knew that he could facilitate and make change happen. Anyway, in 1955, there was this young boy named Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a little 12-year-old boy from Chicago, Illinois, and he went down to the South. You know, Chicago, you know, things are free. You can do just about anything you want in Chicago, Illinois, right? Anyway, so Emmett Till went down that summer to Money, Mississippi to spend time with his grandfather. Well, while he was there, he saw a pretty white woman at the little store because he was buying bubble gum because he had a little bit more money than all the other black children. He was buying a little piece of bubble gum. And so after the lady gave him the change, he sort of whistled to her like that. Well, the white lady took offense that this little black boy had whistled at her. So the Emmett Till went on about his way. Well, somehow or another, the man who owned the store, her husband and brother-in-law, came in the night to Emmett Till's parents' house. They dragged little 10-year-old, 12-year-old Emmett Till out of the bed, took him to the barn, beat him unmercifully, tied his head to a big old cotton gin, and then threw him into the Tallahatchie River. We know the Tallahatchie River because Billy Joe McAllister jumped off that Tallahatchie Bridge. Well, that's exactly where they threw Emmett Till. Well, Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, was so upset that they had done this to her son. And Roy Wilkins, who was head of the NAACP, wasn't doing enough to try and help her. So she had an open casket, and Emmett's face was all swollen, and people could see it. And when people saw Emmett Till's body, black people were outraged, and that was 1955, which was setting the climate for what was to happen in Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama. I want to show you this photograph before I continue on to where Rosa, this is my dad and my mother and Uncle Martin and Uncle Retta, and they're out west. You know, it's two couples. They made this trip sometime early before 1955. They come out west. There's two couples. Anyway. So like I said, Emmett Till was setting the climate for what had happened. And Rosa Parks, on that particular day that she was arrested, she was a secretary at the NAACP. My dad was head of the membership drive. And let me just back up for one quick second because I just forgot one thing really important. How my dad and Uncle Martin met. My dad he left Uncle Andy at Alabama State. So now he is living in Atlanta, Georgia, going to Atlanta University, ITC, getting his master's degree. Uncle Martin was at Morehouse College, where Reverend King Sr. invited the ministers, the young ministers, to come hear his son preach his trial sermon. So my dad and a group of ministers went to hear Uncle Martin preach. So at the close of the service, Uncle Martin was sitting at the back, standing at the back of the door as preachers do. And Daddy went by, shook his hand, and said, "Oh, really nice job, you know, nice to meet you, blah, blah, blah." And they went their separate ways. Uncle Martin he had a voice back then, you know, he was just a young preacher. Anyway, a few days later, my dad had a date with a pretty young lady. So he called this young lady over there at Spelman College, and she said, "Oh, Rev, I'm so sorry, I have a cold. Can I have a rain check?" And so Daddy was like, Sure, we'll do it another time. But you know, once my dad got an idea in his head and whatever plans he had, he decided, well, I'm going to go on to the concert that I was going to take her over there at Spelman College. So he goes over there to the concert early, and there's this huge oak tree. And underneath the oak tree, he sees Martin Luther King. So he's going to go over to Martin Luther King and talk about God. And lo and behold, there's the woman who had stood my dad up. She was on a date with Uncle Martin. And that is the truth of how their friendship started. Anyway, they would see each other, you know, I guess in school. And what happened was Uncle Andy was telling me he was a member over there at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Well, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church was one of those fine churches. It was right there in the shadow of the courthouse, of the Capitol, the Alabama State Capitol, which is also the capital of the Confederacy, where Jefferson Davis had his little White House, you know, during the Civil War. Anyway, so Dexter was also the church of very light-skinned black people. And back then, you know, they used to say your skin had to be the color of a paper bag. You all know this. Paper bag, and your hair had to be able to go through the fine tooth of a comb. Well, I'm too black. I never could have been a member of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and that's all right with me. Anyway, so Dr. Vernon Johns, who Uncle Andy was telling me about this morning, Dr. Johns was very light-skinned, erudite, incredible young pastor, old pastor, but a great young spirit of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And he was an activist in the community. So what he would do is on Sunday morning, he'd throw up his handkerchief and he'd say, I resign. And the deacons would say, oh, Brother Pastor, don't do that. Oh, Brother Pastor, don't do that. But you know, he started stirring up black people. And it was not okay with the people at Dexter Avenue because they were a very uptight and refined black church. Anyway, on one particular morning, he threw up that thing and he said, I resign. And they said, we accept your resignation, Pastor. And just like that, he was gone. Well, Dr. Johns did not want to leave the parsonage. Mrs. Johns left and went on to Virginia. Dr. Johns wouldn't leave, so what they did was they turned off the electricity in the house to get him to leave. Anyway, so he finally left. He found out that young Martin Luther King Jr. was going to be coming to preach his trial sermon. So he went to Atlanta and said, he went over there to Ebenezer Baptist Church and he said to Reverend King Sr., do you mind if I can hitch a ride with your son down there to Montgomery, Alabama? And Reverend King Sr. said, absolutely, Martin, take him. And so he also had asked my dad, could he preach at my dad's church, which was First Baptist? And along that ride, I don't know what they talked about, but he said, I want you to pull up here to this 1327 South Hall Street where we lived, where the Abernathys lived, because I wasn't even born then. Anyway, Dr. Johns was late that night, and my dad knew that he was a hitchhiker and he was, you know, non-conventional. Anyway, Daddy said that when Dr. Johns got out of the car and he saw this teeny-weeny little figure coming up behind him up the walk, and he got into the light, and he saw Uncle Martin's face. Uncle Martin was a little bitty man. He was like 5'7" on a good day. He was teeny-weeny. He was slight. He wore those little wife-beater undershirts. I remember seeing them as a little girl. Anyway, they got into the house and they broke bread. And on that particular night, they talked about the crises of the Negro because Dr. Johns was my dad's mentor. And he was a pioneer of political thought. He was trying to stir black people up. At that point, Rosa Parks was not, there had already been 2 women that had been arrested. Joanne Robinson, who was also another professor at Alabama State, had created the Women's Political Committee. Anyway, so what happened was on December 1st, my mother's birthday, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Now, she was seated where she was supposed to be seated. So let me just show you this right now. So this is the line. The Negro line. It was just a regular line for Negroes, but an imaginary line that they drew. And everybody up here was white. And when you got on the bus back then, you'd put your money, you come in there and put your money in the bus, you'd get off of the bus and you'd go around to the back door to get on the bus if you were black. If you were white, you'd put your money in, get on that bus and go on down that aisle and do whatever you wanted to do. Anyway, Rosa put her money in, she walked around to the back door, and she took her seat. Somewhere along the route, the white section filled up, so the bus driver came and asked her to move. There were people seated beside her. They got up and they moved. Rosa decided she was going to dig her heels in and stay. It was not a planned thing. She was just tired, and she was legally seated in the Negro section. She was in her legal rights anyway. They arrested her. So E.D. Nixon called my dad, and he said, Ralph, you need to do something. We need to do something. I'm a Pullman porter. I got to get on the train, and I got to go north. You do something. So my dad said, I want you to call Martin. Call my friend Martin. E.D. Nixon called Uncle Martin. Daddy, that following morning, met all the black ministers and talked to them about what needed to happen, and that was the first mass meeting. of the Montgomery bus boycott. Anyway, after that, he went and met Joanne Robinson, because at that time, my dad also worked over at Alabama State. He was the dean of men, and he was a professor of mathematics. He went over there to Alabama State, and they ran off the flyers. And then once they got the flyers, after that, they went to meet the little children when they got out of school. And they gave out the flyers to everybody, asking them to stay off of the buses on December 5th. So what happened was, one little boy took it and gave it to his mother. And his mother was a maid for a white woman, and she's like, okay, let me take this to my boss. So she took it to the boss, the white woman that she worked for. She said, ma'am, please, could I have the day off? They're asking us to stay off of the buses on December 5th. Well, this white woman was outraged by this, and she was like, oh my God, let me take this to the newspaper. So then she took it to the white man in the newspaper, and he was like, oh my goodness, we need to run this in the paper. Of course, Negroes are not going to read. And so they ran it in the paper. And by running it in the paper, they alerted all the black people of Montgomery, Alabama to stay off of the buses December 5th. It's ironic, but that's exactly how it happened. Because these were for all the people that missed going over there to the mass meetings. Well, that's how it started. And for 381 days, this boycott went. This is Uncle Martin at that first mass meeting. I want you all to see, seated next to Uncle Martin is the white man. I don't know if you can see him. He's seated sort of to the left of Uncle Martin down front. You see him on the edge of the pulpit? His name is Reverend Robert Gratz. He is the white pastor of an all-black congregation. I love to tell this story, but at that first mass meeting, Uncle Martin said these words: there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. And I want you to know that the poor people of Michigan understand this. There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over, of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing in the piercing chill of an alpine November. Work and fight until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And with that, they took to the streets. Here you see that's my dad in the corner, all the way to the left. That's E.D. Nixon. There's Martin Luther King, and that's Rosa Parks. And Daddy named Rosa the mother of the civil rights movement. And you see all those shiny new cars. What they had to do was they had to buy automobiles and to create their own private little taxi service. And there was not one insurance company in the United States of America that would insure these vehicles. So London, they had to go to Lloyd's of London to get insurance for these automobiles. That's how hateful America was. Here you see black people walking through the rain and walking through the snow. And it says, we shall overcome with liberty and justice for all, for 381 days. Here they are at the Highlander Folk School. And the little girl in the middle, her name is Karis Horton. Her father, Miles Horton, ran the Highlander Folk School in Mount Eagle, Tennessee. That's Uncle Martin. Behind him is Pete Seeger, the white man, the folk singer who wrote We Shall Overcome, and Karis and Rosa Parks and my dad. And there they are learning nonviolence. And because they were learning nonviolence as a way and as a philosophy, people tried to say they were communists. Well, they were not communists. Anyway, once the civil rights movement started, once Montgomery started, Bayard Rustin came down. Bayard Rustin had been at Morehouse College with Uncle Martin, and he suggested to Uncle Martin the idea of nonviolence, that this be a nonviolent movement, because Bayard was with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Anyway, Bayard Rustin was a homosexual man, a blatant homosexual man. And that made Uncle Martin uncomfortable. So he went to my dad and he said, Ralph, you have to tell Bayard that he has to leave. And so my dad went to him and he said to him, you have to leave, that it would be better that you don't bring controversy to us. We appreciate everything, but you'd have to go. And that was the way things were back then. I don't necessarily agree with it. Those were Uncle Martin's wishes. Bayard was angry with my dad for it for the remainder of his life. But that's the truth of it. So the man who taught my dad and Uncle Martin nonviolence was this white man, Glenn Smiley, who came down from the Fellowship of Reconciliation to replace Bayard Rustin. And when Jim Lawson comes, he'll be able to tell you more about Glenn, because Glenn was from Pasadena, California. And I used to meet them like once a month, Glenn Smiley and Jim Lawson, and they taught me nonviolence. But that's Glenn, and the history books, when you look at him, they won't mention Glenn Smiley. And I think they don't mention Glenn Smiley because people were segregationists. They don't want black and white to be together. And so that must be why they don't mention him in the history books. But on my dad's deathbed, he kept repeating, Glenn Smiley, Glenn Smiley. Glenn Smiley taught me and Martin the principles of nonviolence. So wherever I go, I tell people that because I want people to know who he was and what he did and his contribution. Not only was he there in Montgomery, he was there in Birmingham, he was there in Selma, always there. And when my dad died and I was in Los Angeles, Glenn was there again. That's his wife, Helen. That's my mother, that's my dad, that's my sister, and they're in my parents' home. Anyway, they came and bombed Uncle Martin's, they threw a piece of dynamite when the boycott started, and it messed up a part of the stoop, but that was all. So the deacons and everybody came, and they were real upset, and they brought all these guns to Uncle Martin, and Uncle Martin was like, no, 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 I don't need those. We have got to take care of this in a very nonviolent fashion. Well, on the particular day that they threw the dynamite at Uncle Martin's porch, there was this KKK man who was driving to take dynamite to throw at my parents' house. Well, as things would happen, it backfired and the dynamite went off in the man's car. So they had to take him to the hospital. And when he gets to the hospital, he says, please, can somebody get Ralph David Abernathy? I need to apologize. I need to apologize. I had the dynamite in my car because I was supposed to bomb their home and it messed up and I just have to play. I want to ask for forgiveness. But he told this to the nurse, who then told it to my mother and told it to my father. But the man died before my dad could get there at the hospital to, give forgiveness to this particular man for his anger and his hatred. This is a letter from the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, and my dad named the Montgomery Improvement Association, and Uncle Martin was chosen as the head of it. And he is dead in Uncle Martin at the close of those 381 days, and that's Glenn right there, seated in front of Uncle Martin. And whenever you see Martin, because there's a famous photograph of Martin Luther King and a white man seated on that bus, that man is Glenn Smiley. Anyway, here you see people getting on the bus. And for every good that happened, there was something bad that would happen in return. So Daddy, Uncle Martin, and Uncle Retta decided that they're going to go to Atlanta for the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a new organization. So January 10th, 1957, my mother was pregnant with me. And she said, I'm not going. I'm nauseous, I'm pregnant, I don't want to be bothered. So she stayed. And she was alone in the house. She tried to get Rosa, our housekeeper, to come and stay the night with her. And she said, no, Miss Abernathy, I'm going to have a date tonight, and I don't want you to know what time I'm going to come back in from my date. So, no, I'm not staying with you. Because if Rosa had stayed, she'd have been staying in the front room, the guest room, which was on the front. So Mother was there alone, and she had just gotten up from watching the Jack Parr show. And you all remember Jack Parr. So she said she'd fallen asleep watching Jack Parr, and she thought the angels must have awakened her. And because something told her to get up and move. And she went back into the bedroom where my sister was in the crib. She was in the bedroom for about 15 minutes, and there was this huge explosion. And they planted the bomb or dynamite right down there where the opening is. Let's see here. There's no way for me to go over there. but there's a gaping hole there underneath the porch and where the gas line was. If the KKK people had been more intelligent and better students, they would have known their math and known to move the dynamite just 1 inch closer instead of guesstimating. They'd have put it 1 inch closer, and if they'd have put it 1 inch closer, I'm telling you that explosion would have just been huge. My mother would have died, my sister would have died, and I never would have been born. Anyway, so when the dynamite, went off, mother, one neighbor came to help her, and the police officers came, and they immediately started roping off the house. And so my mother got on the phone and she called Daddy, and he was at Reverend King Sr.'s house, and it was the middle of the night. Well, Reverend King Sr. was upset. He was not a nonviolent man like Daddy and Uncle Martin. And he was like, are you kidding me? You all have gotten all these white people stirred up? Why? Why? And so he's giving them the business. Mother hears another explosion. She jumps. She says that the police officer said, oh, that would be the First Baptist Church, which was my dad's church. My mother got on the phone and called Reverend King Sr.'s house again. Got Dad and Uncle Martin. And Uncle Martin's book, in his book, Strength to Love, he said, with Ralph's home and church bombed, there was nothing we could do but get down on our knees and ask the Lord for strength to carry on. Strength for endurance for the hard days that will come ahead. And they decided that this was not going to stop them. This would only be motivation for them. Anyway, they bombed, this is First Baptist Church, my dad's church that they bombed that night. They bombed my parents' home, First Baptist Church. They bombed the home of Reverend Robert Gratz, that white minister that I pointed out to you all earlier. They bombed Bell Street and they bombed Mount Olive. They went crazy bombing 5 churches that night. That's Uncle Martin. He's arrested there for loitering outside court. My dad was on trial, before my dad died. He had this thing on his back, and I used to, give him massages. Like I said, I worshiped him. It's sacrilegious, but I just thought he was like heaven on earth. I wanted to rub his scalp and rub his feet, rub his back, do everything I could for him because he made it possible for me to live in the world the way I live. He gave me freedom. So I was indebted to Daddy and Uncle Martin. So anything that I could do for him, I wanted to do. And he had this big, huge thing on his back. And I'd always ask him about it. He would never tell me about it. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about nonviolence. When you're in a nonviolent situation, there are 3 things you can do. You can fight back, you can run, or you can say to your oppressor, wait a second, I love you. Well, what Daddy did on this particular day, this angry black man came with a hatchet to my dad. And my dad said, well, let me get out of here. This man is crazy. And he took off running. And the man took the hatchet and he threw it. And it lodged in my dad's shoulder blades. And that was the scar that my dad had. And he was there at the trial trying to take care of that. And that's where we see this photograph of Uncle Martin. Here you see them just as Negro leaders. And there they are. They were equal back then. And this was the 4th Annual Institute of Nonviolence, if you all can read that. And that's the way I knew them. Daddy was the thinker. Uncle Martin was the voice, but Daddy was the thinker and the planner and trying to figure out how to keep the peace and make everything work. And you can see the photograph. It's worth 1,000 words. It tells the story for you. Uncle Martin's thinking, what do we do? What do we do? And there's Dad like, well, let me see. This is Jackie Robinson and Wyatt T. Walker. And Uncle Andy, I didn't have the other photograph of the 3 of you all. And I guess this is Albany at a bombed out church. Yeah. And Jackie Robinson was using his celebrity for good. And that's what I wish people would do today, is use their celebrity for good to get involved and to try and uplift the community instead of be like this young man. There's an angry young man named 50 Cent who said that Negroes need to be shot and killed to be remembered, to be reminded of, you know, who's in charge. And we have our young people killing each other in random, senseless acts of violence. Here they are again, Daddy and Uncle Martin, Jackie Robinson, Wyatt T. Walker, who worked with Uncle Martin. He was a director at the SCLC. And all the way to the right is Fred Shuttlesworth, who was head of the Birmingham movement. And the white man is a congressman from New York. I forgot his last name. But they are so beautifully attired and they look exactly the same. They prided themselves in their presentation and who they were and how they were as men. They prided themselves on being great speakers and knowing how to make their verbs and nouns agree. That's me right there in the middle, that little girl right there. At the late night, like I said, things would happen in my parents' house, and I would get up out of the bed, and that's Aunt Coretta, and that's my mother, and that's me seated on Uncle Martin's lap. And we get up out of the bed. I'll never forget when the Freedom Riders came, and everybody was in the front, and my sister and I were in the back, and I had these little braids, and my sister said, "Here, let me just snip this." And she took the scissors and she cut. You know, I would pretty much been bald-headed my whole life. And see, this is after she had snipped it. And I have a little bow on my head. I'm seated on my dad's lap and Aunt Coretta's on the phone. And then there's my sister and me and Aunt Coretta. I remember when the Freedom Riders came. They came and when they were at my dad's church, you know, when they went to Anniston, Alabama, because I'm sure you all remember Diane Nash and Reverend Jim Lawson, who's going to come and tell you all what it was like to be a Freedom Rider and his experiences being head of the Memphis movement. Anyway, so when they went to Anniston, they set the bus on fire. When they got to Birmingham, they beat them unmercifully. The police fled and left the people at the mercy of the KKK. Well, when they got to Montgomery, what they did was they got off of the bus. John Siegenthaler was with them, and they just started beating the people. Beat John Lewis and beat Jim Swerg. And anyway, that evening they went to my dad's church to have a mass meeting, and they had the mass meeting at First Baptist, and they overturned the car. And they set it on fire and they trapped the people in the church, and they were trapped all night long. So Daddy and Uncle Martin are on the phone with Bobby Kennedy, who was on the phone with Governor Patterson. And so Governor Patterson said, well, you know, the police will take care of them. So he turned the policemen who were also part of the White Citizens Council and the KKK, and they were supposed to be protecting these people when they had just turned over the car. Well, Bobby Kennedy said that wasn't good enough. So he decided to send in the National Guard, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, the National Guard came in, and Governor Patterson was so angry he declared martial law. Anyway, the following year, I guess in 1961, George Wallace became the governor of Alabama. In his inaugural address, he said, "Segregation today, segregation now, segregation forever." He was a really angry, hateful man. And in Birmingham is where they turned the water hoses and the dogs on young, innocent people, and they turned them on little children. And here you can see the people on the ground on their knees, because that's the second day of them turning the water hoses on the people. And what they did was, Daddy said in the mass meeting that when they came in drenched with their bodies, you know, drenched from blood and from the water, the young people said, "We're going to get down on our knees so they won't be able to knock us down from the power of the water hose." And that was the power of nonviolence. And you'll be able to see the people on their knees. It's very clear they're on their knees. Did I touch something by mistake? Anyway, so what happened was, I don't know what to do here. Just close it? Okay. There we go. Thank you. I'm technologically challenged. So what they did was, on the third and the fourth day, Police Chief Bull Connor, he told the firemen, "Turn on those goddamn hoses." And the firemen refused to turn on the hoses because people were on their knees and they were praying, and they were women. The majority of them were women. There were women that filled the churches. And like this evening, well, you know, this is a good count. This is probably an even room. But more often than not, it's women that fill the churches. It's women who go and want to stand out and be a part of change. And here you see the dogs. And you all saw earlier Daddy and Uncle Martin dressed exactly alike, and they were walking. That was a Good Friday march, and what happened was they went in there to Birmingham, and I know I got to speak really quickly. They went in there to Birmingham, and the merchants came to them, and they said, listen, we don't want you all to march. And see, Easter is the time of year when black people like to spend all this money. You know, we have to have brand new clothes at Easter time. We got to have the basket, the hat, the dress, the crinoline, all that stuff, you know, to prove that we love Jesus. And so what would happen was they decided that they were going to boycott at Easter. And by boycotting at Easter, then the department stores would understand, you know, we're not going to spend our money there. And if we don't spend our money in your department store, then all of a sudden people are like, maybe they have a valid point. Maybe we ought to let them use the dressing room. Maybe we ought to let them use the toilet. You know, they were bragging that the one thing we could do was we could use the elevator together. Well, that didn't make any sense to us. So they decided to wear the dungarees. You were supposed to wear dungarees to church, and that's why they're dressed in these dungarees, and they were dressed exactly alike. Anyway, they grabbed them, and they grabbed them by the seat of their pants, and they threw them into the paddy wagon. And then one of the police officers said, well, where do we take them? Do we take them to the city jail? No, the city jail is full. Where do we take them? We take them to the county? No, the county jail is full. Because all these young people, young people, you know, school-age people, girls that were 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, you all were the people who were filling the jails. You all were the revolutionaries. I'm sorry, it just wasn't the older people. I'm just telling you the way it was. They were young. And Daddy and Uncle Martin were, of course, young. And he said, so what, do we take them to the fairgrounds? No, the fairgrounds are full. So Bull Connor said, don't arrest another GD N-word. And that's when Daddy and Uncle Martin were in the paddy wagon all by themselves. And so what happened was they took them down to the jail and they separated them. And when they separated, with Uncle Martin left to brood on toilet paper, he wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail as to why we could not wait, why we needed our freedom, what we had endured for 244 years and then 100 years of Jim Crow. Anyway, he gave it to Wyatt T. Walker, and Wyatt took it out. There they are in jail. My dad went to jail 44 times for our freedom, and there's Uncle Martin. He's in jail. He went to jail 13 times. The only reason my dad went to jail more times was because he lived longer. They were never in jail for being drunk, or for violence, or for abuse. They were in jail executing their rights for civil disobedience for our freedom. Then right after that came the March on Washington, and Uncle Martin delivered that prophetic speech, I Have a Dream. And Uncle Andy and I were talking about it this morning in the car, and I'll never forget running around at the top up there, and Benjamin Mays, who at that point was president of Morehouse College, saying to me, do you know what this day is about? I'm like, yes. He was like trying to calm me down and sent me down to sit on the steps with my dad and my sister and my brother. So we were seated when Uncle Martin went up to the microphone to speak and preach. And I'm telling you, it was like fire. And I just remember when he said, my 4 little children, my sister and I jumped up and down screaming because Yoki wasn't there. Dexter and Marty weren't there. Uncle Retta didn't bring them. But my mother was insistent that we go and be there and be a part of everything. Anyway, here you see the people, and they say it was 250,000. It had to be more. But on the internet is a picture of my dad, a piece where he talks about it being the greatest day of his life, and how he and Uncle Martin at the close of the March on Washington sat on those steps, and he said it was nothing but the wind blowing, the placards, and they talked about what it meant to them. They were just trying to take it all in because there was not a single act of violence. Nonviolence was an important thing. Nonviolence was a way of life. It wasn't just rhetoric. My dad never raised his hand to hit me, my sister, my brother, my mother. He got mad at my brother, but never at my mother and us. He didn't. The only time he raised his voice was when he had a stroke and it became more difficult for him to speak. And he was trying to get his words out, and we'd mess with him on purpose so that he would force to get the words out of his mouth. That was the only time my dad ever raised his voice. Anyway, a few weeks later, it was actually exactly 2 weeks later at 16th Street Baptist Church, the bomb went off, and it was Children's Day, and children were supposed to take over the church. And all the little children were asked to wear white, and my poor friend Sarah Collins, her mother was dirt poor, and she bought a little red dress for Sarah. And so at the close of Sunday school, the girls went into the bathroom. I told everybody about this early this morning, but I'll just tell you really fast. It was my friend Sarah Collins, who was 12 years old, her sister Addie Mae, who was 14, Denise McNair, who was 11 years old, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson, who were both 14 years of age. And they went into the bathroom, and they were primping. Sarah went into the stall and came out and got ready to wash her hands. And Denise McNair said to Addie Mae, she said, "Will you please tie my sash?" She was tying her sash, and they heard a click, and they all turned to the window, and in came shards of glass and bricks and mortar. There was a brick that lodged itself into the head of 11-year-old Denise McNair. Cynthia Wesley, she was decapitated, and the only thing that held her together was the skin that held her neck to her body. Reverend Cross, the pastor of the church, Mr. Lay, this man right here with the megaphone, because we didn't have black law enforcement officers. We had civil defense workers, and he was the civil defense worker who patrolled 16th Street Baptist Church. And the week before, he had seen somebody there attempting to do something, but he caught them or whatever and made them drive on. And he called Reverend Cross, and Reverend Cross came down, and they walked around the church, and everything was fine. But this next following week, they missed it. Anyway, he said, "Reverend Cross, please come into the crater." And that's when he went into the crater, and he found the bodies piled one on top of the other. And my friend Sarah, they found her, as they were getting ready to leave, they heard her faint moan. They moved over in the direction of the moan and cleared away the debris. And there they found my friend Sarah. And a wedge of glass had gone into her eye, and she was blinded. Right today, her forehead is still bumpy because shards of glass are still in her forehead. And she was telling me that she still has glass in this eye, the right eye, because, and she had to have eye surgery recently, and she's almost lost that vision. But she's an incredible woman, but a dirt poor woman. She works as a maid. And as people make money off of the civil rights movement and become rich, all these so-called leaders, it angers me because Sarah and her sister gave her life, and Sarah gave her eyesight and everything so that we would have a civil rights bill, and she works today as a common laborer. Something's wrong with that equation, why this woman wasn't given the opportunity to have an education and to be able to better herself. It doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, that's the whole. And then a few weeks later, they killed our president, November 22nd. And all of this will be the 50th anniversary this year of everything that happened in 1963. And I like to conclude this picture of Bobby Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover but J. Edgar Hoover bugged our homes, and he hated them. He hated Daddy and Uncle Martin like you wouldn't believe. And he hated the Kennedys because of their stand on civil rights. And Mrs. Kennedy said that's why she believed they assassinated her husband. Anyway, here's Daddy and Uncle Martin back on the move, and they're in St. Augustine, Florida, trying to integrate basic things. And, you know, I know you all don't have the ocean over here, but, you know, down there in the deep south, we couldn't go to the beach when I was a little girl. And man didn't control that beach or create that water, but in the deep south, they didn't let us go. And in Maryland, if you worked in Ocean City, Maryland, by sundown, if you were a Negro, you had to be away from the beach. It wasn't open to the public. So when you all go there to the ocean, submerge your feet in there for all our ancestors who didn't have that opportunity to go in there and to take in that water and the ease of just being there in the ocean, that calm that comes over you when you're there at the ocean. In California, where I live, there's a little section of Santa Monica, and they got a little teeny-weeny little plaque where black people could go, just a teeny-weeny little section. But here you get to see that angry man choke that black man. Anyway, right after the bomb went off at 16th Street Baptist Church, I couldn't go to the bathroom anymore because I had participated in the March on Washington. The Freedom Riders had come and stayed in my parents' home. I was active in the civil rights movement. So that's me, that little girl right there. I'm holding myself because I thought that if I went to the bathroom, the bomb would go off. And every day in nursery school and kindergarten, I would urinate on myself. And my mother would send me to school every day with a little bag with fresh panties, soap, and a washcloth so that I'd clean myself up because I'd lay there on my cart and just urinate for fear. And I ended up holding myself too much, and there's just proof of the trauma that comes, you know. Anyway, in '64, Uncle Martin got the Nobel Prize, and the sad thing about the Nobel Prize is he worked so hard, and Daddy had worked so hard. Anyway, the day of the Nobel Prize, Uncle Martin said, "Ralph, you're going to be riding with me." So Mother and Daddy went down to arrive to get into the car with Uncle Martin. Well, they had a small car, and there was no room for my dad and my mother. And all the other cars were taken up, and all the taxis were taken up. And they were in Oslo, Norway, in the freezing cold. And my mother and father were left standing on the street. And all the cars were gone. And Daddy was like, "Come on, Juanita, we got to get there. We got to get there," because he was so determined. So they went walking. And they walked to Uncle Martin's ceremony in the freezing cold. And when they finally got there, the ceremony was over. He missed it. My mother was so upset, and her body just shut down, and so she had an attack of angina, and they hospitalized my mother. And in the history books, I want people to know, my mother had an attack of angina, and Taylor Branch and David Garrow write that my mother wanted attention, so she faked a heart attack. Well, that's not true. My mother had to walk in that cold, and she kept everything bottled up inside, and her heart reacted. That's that evening, Daddy and Bernard, who was Uncle Martin's traveling companion, Wyatt T. Walker, who was a director at SCLC, Uncle Martin, and Andrew Young, who had recently joined on to their team. So Mother was in the hospital, and then she got out, and then Daddy and Uncle Martin went on to Rome, to the Vatican, and there they met Pope Paul. And my dad always was so, you know, he was a great religious leader. My dad was a minister, so you get a chance to see my dad locking eyes with the Pope, and there's Uncle Martin. He's so charismatic. He's looking at the camera. He was so cool. I remember when he smoked cool cigarettes. And then he started smoking Salem cigarettes, and he would almost let chain smoke. I loved it, and I didn't love the cigarettes, but, you know, Yoki and Wandlin would take them and try to do, you know, you try to do what you see the adults do, and so that's what they did. And then Yoki started smoking cigarettes, and ultimately that's why she lost her life, because of the cigarette smoking, and it was bad on her heart. And Uncle Martin used to bite his fingernails, and because he bit his fingernails, I bit my fingernails, and even now I'm really bad about doing that grooming because I just get nervous and just start chewing them like he did, because we wanted to be like them because they were so great. Anyway, that's Uncle Martin with Big Mama. That's his mother, and we used to do Thanksgiving with Big Mama. And we saw Uncle Martin every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. After church, we all convene and go to Pascal's or Morrison's or whatever. And that's his book, Strength to Love, because it takes strength to love. And there, in that book, is where he talks about my dad's church and home being bombed. Anyway, that's him at a press conference and the movie cameras. And I used to walk backwards with the movie cameras. Anyway, that's Mrs. Amelia Boynton on the ground, that we were fighting for the right to vote. I'm going to hurry up. And you see the men on the horses, and the sheriff with the billy club, and they met him with tear gas. And John Lewis, whom I hope that you invite to come here to tell his story. He just lost his wife, Lillian Lewis, just as before the last of the year came to an end. On New Year's Eve, Lillian Lewis left us. But John Lewis and Jose Williams walked across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I'll never forget them calling Daddy in his pulpit. And he came out of the pulpit, and he called Uncle Martin, and he said, they want to march. And Uncle Martin's like, no. And Daddy's like, you got to let them march. If we don't let them march, Jose will be mad at me forever. We got to let Jose march. And this was Jose Williams. So they said, okay. So Jose and John Lewis led that march, and they went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they were met with billy clubs, Sheriff Jim Clark and Al Lingo and George Wallace. They were so hateful, and they beat those people unmercifully, and it became known in history as Bloody Sunday. And I'll never forget sitting in Pascal's, and they were just like, oh my goodness, this is just a disaster. It's just absolutely horrible. Anyway, what they did was they made several attempts. The second attempt, all these ministers came down and to be a part of this march. They had an organized second attempt, and they were met by Alabama State Patrol in numbers you would not believe. So everybody got down on their knees, and my dad prayed a prayer, because my dad could pray. And our Uncle Martin believed, and we all believed when my Ralph Abernathy prayed, God listened to his prayers. Anyway, he prayed, and then Uncle Martin turned the march around, and everybody went back peacefully. Well, Reverend James Reeb was this white minister that was in that group, and he and two other ministers went to eat at the Soul Food restaurant there in Selma. Well, when they left the Soul Food restaurant, the KKK saw 3 white men coming out of a black restaurant. Well, I'm telling you, they were so upset, they didn't know what to do. So they took and beat Reverend James Reeb and those other ministers unmercifully. And 2 days later, Reverend James Reeb died in the hospital. But he died for our freedom, and that was Selma. Anyway, this is Daddy and Uncle Martin, their heads together in Brown Chapel at the memorial that they're giving for Reverend James Reeb. And that's the way I knew them, with their heads together, always planning, whispering to each other. Here you see them walking through some angry men, and that's in Montgomery, as they're trying to recruit people from Selma. And Uncle Martin is averting the eyes of his aggressors. You know, there are a lot of young men who'd be like, oh, wait a minute, let me take you on. Let me see you. You looking at me dirty, let me look at you dirty. Well, they were wiser. A wise man turns and walks away and gets to live another day. You know, you don't need to look at every bit of trouble just to prove that you have testosterone flowing through the veins. I love this photograph of Daddy and Uncle Martin, because they don't know what's happening, and you don't always have to pretend that you know what's happening. You see them, they're totally lost and totally human and vulnerable. Here they are laid out on the floor, and Daddy's in the middle of the room there trying to keep that peace. Uncle A.D., Uncle Martin's brother, is all the way in extreme left. Andy Young is on the floor. That's James Farmer from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Daddy in the middle, and then James Foreman. They see their names are so close. From the Congress of Racial Equality, Denzel Washington made a movie called The Great Debaters, and he's the young boy that became that man who headed up CORE and the Freedom Riders. And there's Uncle Martin laid out in the middle of the floor. So cool, so cool. And so charismatic. He could come into a room and he'd just take focus, and he just sort of like leaned, you know. You know, he had that way about him. He was special. And Daddy was special too, but in a different way. And my dad spoke so, he knew how to make people laugh. He knew how to touch your heart, and he made sure he connected with every single human being. Anyway, here they are on this march, and I love that. That's Rabbi Abraham Heschel with the beard and the extreme at the end. If it weren't for the Jewish people that got involved, I don't know what would have happened. Not only were they our lawyers, they were the friends, and they gave their lives. You know, that's Ralph Bunch, Uncle Martin, Daddy, a Catholic nun, and John Lewis. And that was from the Hawaiian delegation. Anyway, you see them walking, and up above is Constance Baker Motley, who worked with Thurgood Marshall. And then that's that picture of me again, and I have no memory of this day whatsoever. When I did my book, I found this photograph, and I watched my whole life unfold before me. This part of that day I remember. That's Sammy Davis Jr. and my sister's getting her kiss, and I'm waiting. I'm seated on my dad's lap after Uncle Sammy had performed, waiting for my kiss. And when he kissed us, we vowed we'd never wash our faces again. And we didn't for one whole week. It was just incredible. And I loved it because my dad was the treasurer. He would always sit on the money at the airport. He accounted for every nickel and every dime. Black people we could give change. We didn't have a whole lot of money. But I think it was the first time I ever saw a $100 bill because Harry Belafonte brought all those movie stars and all this money. And Tony Bennett, he sang I Left My Heart in San Francisco that night. It was just incredible, all the movie stars. And Peter, Paul, and Mary. I just remember Mary's shiny blonde hair and me just standing there looking at her like, she has two men. She has two men. I just, as a little child, you don't quite understand. These are the thoughts that went through my head. Anyway, there I am standing at the end with the striped set, and my sister's in white, and Uncle Martin is standing there at the microphone, and he's thanking Harry and all the movie stars that have come. And as a little child, I think I know what's going on. I think I know. But ultimately, I really didn't know. I really didn't know the gravity of the situation. I didn't know the danger. All the danger that I knew was that they called every day and threatened to kill us. And I knew that at nighttime I'd have to knock between the wall to my brother because all I thought was they'd bomb our house. They'd bomb it again. And my mother had the angel photograph over the two little children, which just like killed me because it was like, oh my God, we're gonna die in the night. And you'd say your prayers every night, hoping you'd make it through the morning. And there we are on the march that following morning, waiting for Uncle Martin to come, and Daddy's doing his thing. I was a shy little girl. I had my hands in my mouth, and my brother has his hands in his pants, as boys always do. And there's my mother behind us laughing, and John Lewis in a little white vest. And then there we are on the front lines again as we lining up for that march. There's a white man all the way in the extreme left. His name is Jim Letherer. You see his crutch. He used to walk the front lines with us. He walked that 55 miles from Selma to Montgomery on one leg. One leg for black people to have the right to vote. So how can you be angry? How can you have hatred in your heart for white people when you see people sacrificing equally for your freedom and your liberty? Anyway, that's us right there on the front lines. As we start the march, everybody's lining up and our feet are moving. We're walking because Uncle Martin would run late. He ran late a lot, didn't he? A lot. Yeah, he had his own time. And here is the famous photograph of that march. Anyway, here they are, the close-up of them receiving the pen from the Voting Rights Act. And Daddy and the President and Teddy Kennedy and Uncle Martin. He's looking at Mother, giving Mother the eye about what, I have no idea. But she was tough. And she's loquacious. She loves to talk. She loves to engage. So obviously she's saying something funny. And everybody's gone in that photograph but Mother. And here, Mother, they asked us, did we want to do our part? And I said, I was the first child. I said, I'll raise my hand. I raised my hand. I said, yes, I wanted, and that's me all the way in the extreme right corner with my little books. That's my sister, my mother, Marty, Yoki, and Aunt Coretta. He's really Martin. He's grown up, but when he was little, he was Marty. And this was mass integration in Dixie. Brown versus the Board of Education passed in 1955, and it really wouldn't be until 1965, 10 years later, that integrations of school would be forced. And when we went to school, we had the media, we had angry parents, we had hateful, it was a hard situation. It's a whole other story. But I'm glad we did it because we made it possible for children to enjoy education today. There they are with Stokely Carmichael, Daddy and Uncle Martin in their Blues Brothers sunglasses. And that's Uncle Martin and Dexter as he's getting ready to go back to jail. He always had books. Books were the most important thing. My dad had, oh my God, a whole library of books, and he had great books of the Western world, and he read them. That's what I loved. He read them. He was always reading the newspaper, reading whatever he could. And when he ultimately had his stroke, the thing that got him was he lost his peripheral vision. So he'd have to move his head to see words. And it became so difficult. And when he wrote his autobiography, which I have copies of out there, what he had to do was somebody had to read it to him, read it back what he had written. It broke his heart. Here they are with poor children and the Poor People's Campaign would come right after that. And today we enjoy a national food stamp program that my dad was responsible for and he lobbied for. The other thing is that low-income children can get a free lunch at school. My dad lobbied for that. That's Dad and Uncle Martin and Uncle A.D. There they are at a press conference. There they are, talking, and that's Ossie Davis, and that's Uncle Martin's getting ready to speak out against the war in Vietnam, and that's at Riverside Church in New York. That's the cover now of my book, and I granted it's all men, women, please forgive me, but there's clergymen of all different faiths walking through Arlington National Cemetery, protesting the war in Vietnam, protesting violence, and that's why I love this photograph. Anyway, this is Memphis, I Am a Man, and Reverend Jim Lawson's going to tell you a little bit more about that story. So when he gets here, and you all will hear it next week, but the thing, that's that balcony where Uncle Martin would be assassinated, and what happened was they were not allowed to march, and they had been issued an injunction that they weren't supposed to march, and Uncle Martin had been, they had gone to Memphis and there had been a violent march, and then they had gone back to Atlanta, and then they called for them to come back to Memphis again. So they go back to Memphis, and Uncle Martin was reluctant to go back to Memphis, and he is seated on the plane, and they held the plane on the ground, and they said, we have a celebrity on board, we have a bomb threat, you all are gonna have to wait while we check out the plane. And they said that was Martin Luther King was on board, and Uncle Martin turned to my dad and he said, Ralph, why do they have to do it this way? Why do they have to taunt me? Because they were starting to get to him. Anyway, they finally got to Memphis, and they had to speak at the Mason Temple. And here they are in the hotel room, you know, figuring out what they're going to do because they can't march. Anyway, Jesse Jackson said he wanted to speak that night, and Uncle Martin said, no, Jesse, you're not going to speak. Ralph, you're going to speak. So my dad went on ahead to the Mason Temple, and when he got to the room, the people erupted in applause, and my dad was like, wow, all these people have come out in the rain, let me go to the phone. And he went to the phone, and he called Uncle Martin, he said, Martin, man, you need to come on here, you need to get here, this is your crowd, promise me you're going to come. He said, yeah, I'm going to come. And then Uncle Martin finally came. And the way that Daddy says, and Uncle Andy was telling me that my dad would warm up the crowd for Uncle Martin in Albany. And in Birmingham, I got the speeches where Daddy would speak, and then Uncle Martin would speak, and then Daddy would turn around and make it plain so that people would take to the streets. But on this particular night, Daddy said to Uncle Martin, let me speak first. And my dad went into this long, eloquent introduction of Uncle Martin. And so what happened was when Uncle Martin went to the microphone, he said, Ralph David Abernathy is the best friend that I have in the world, and you can look on the internet and see his speech verbatim. And then he went on to say that he'd been to the mountaintop. He'd seen the promised land, that I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people shall make it to the promised land, and I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And when he finished his speech, he was drenched with perspiration, and he turns and he goes back and just collapses into my dad's arms. Anyway, the following day, they had food at a little hotel diner, and the waitress got the order wrong, and so they ate off of one little plate. And then they went back into the staff to have a meeting with the staff, and you know, Andrew Young had been missing all day, and Uncle Martin was upset. He didn't know where he was, and they ended up having a pillow fight. Anyway, they decided that it was time for them to go on about their business, and they went on to the hotel room, got dressed, and they were going to go to dinner to Reverend Billy Kyle's house. And Reverend Kyle arrived, and they called Mrs. Kyle to find out what the menu was, and Uncle Martin said, well, I'm ready. I'm going out on the balcony. So he went on out into the balcony, and my dad was inside, and he was putting on his cologne, and somebody said down below, you know, he said to Jesse, you know, Jesse, I'm making it up to you tonight. You can come on to dinner since you couldn't speak last night, and bring Ben Branch with you, who played the saxophone, this great musician. And somebody said, Dr. King, you need to bring a coat. And my dad had put the cologne in his hands. He had Aramis, and he put it on his cheek. And as he got ready to put it on his cheek, he said he heard something that sounded like a firecracker, and he turned, and he saw Uncle Martin laid out. Well, he ran to Uncle Martin, and he saw that a hole was in his right cheek. and he was moving his lips. And so my dad started to pat his other cheek, and he was like, Martin, this is Ralph. Martin, this is Ralph. And then his eyes were wobbly, and they just locked on to my dad. And he tried to say something, but he couldn't speak. And then Andy came to them, and he was like, oh, Ralph, it's over, it's all over. And he was all upset. And my dad, who never raised his voice except in church to say how much he loved the Lord, he started yelling at Andy, and he said, don't you say that, don't you say that. And then he got up and he told Reverend Billy Kyle to go and get someone on the phone. Well, anyway, the bottom line is the ambulance finally came. Dad and Bernard Lee got into the ambulance, and they took Uncle Martin to the hospital. They took the scissors, as you all know, you all in the medical profession, and they cut the clothes off. And there was this big gaping hole in Uncle Martin's chest, the size of my dad's fist, and my dad had big hands. Anyway, the doctors were working on Uncle Martin, and then they said, they came over to my dad, and they said, listen, the bullet has severed his spinal cord. It'll be an act of mercy if God takes him now. And my dad was like, oh no, please, please, you got to work on him. You got to do whatever you can. You got to save him. So then the doctors went back over, and he worked on him. And then he finally said to him, he said, listen, Dr. Abernathy, we've done all we can do. There's nothing we can do. If you want to spend these final moments with him, you can. So then Daddy went over to Uncle Martin, and he took him up in his arms, and he cradled him. And then his breathing got less and less and less, and then he was gone. And like Abraham Lincoln, my dad used to say, he now belongs to the ages, and now he belongs to all of you. We have a beautiful holiday today where we honor him. He was love, he was light, he was magic, he was fun. He gave us our family vacations, the bedroom suite that my mother enjoys today every night. Uncle Martin bought for us. He was a great man. There they take him out on the gurney. There they are pointing as he's down below. The lady at the front desk had a heart attack when she found out that he'd been shot and died. There you see him getting ready to march in Memphis, because we went to Memphis and marched again. That's Mrs. Kennedy, who came to be a part of the funeral. There were all the people, hundreds of thousands of people that came. Uncle Retta asked us to all wear white. Daddy loved Uncle Martin so much he wanted to carry him in a wagon to be representative of the poor people that he served. That's me right there, that little girl in the white dress. And my head was down, I was hurt. I was so angry with God. I remember when Harry Belafonte got into our limousine that day, and I was like, why is he here? Why is he here? I was so angry, and I told my mother that I hated God because he had betrayed us. I didn't understand, because I just knew that, he'd been stabbed. Uncle Martin had told us how he'd been stabbed with a letter opener, and if he had sneezed, he would have died, but that he made it through. And why didn't he make it through? It just didn't make any sense to me. Anyway, where he's buried today, my dad paid for the land. If you ever get a chance to go to Atlanta and see the eternal flame, my dad paid for the land for where he is buried today. And in that crypt where he lays, Uncle Retta lays in that crypt with him. Granddaddy King came and he said, Ebenezer won't give us the land. And my dad said, I'll give you the money and I'll pay for it. Anyway, my dad carried on after Uncle Martin. There he is with Ed Brooke, trying to make the holiday come to be. Here he is getting his honorary doctorate degree with Truman Capote. There he is with his friend Cesar Chavez, who came to him and he said, listen, Ralph, nobody respects Latino people. Help me help the migrant farm workers. And my dad organized America, and we boycotted grapes. It was an incredible time, and they were working together. Here he is as a pastor with his brothers all around him and in front of him. That's me with my dad and his book. That's what I used to look like when I was with him, and he has a smile on his face. That's my hero. That's my dad. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Wonderful.